you all for coming tonight. Let me close this out and get this going and get it set up. Great. So tonight we're going to talk about the Holland Fire and local media. Thinking about different ways, when I heard that the Newsflash exhibit was coming, I thought of what better topic to cover than the Holland Fire and how it would be covered today in media. So this is a picture of the Holland Fire from the Holland Central Archives. And we're used to seeing pictures like this of historic events, right? But at the time of the Holland Fire, photography was kind of a new thing. It was kind of a novel technology. Newspapers were just text. And when Michelle asked me to speak about the different changes in media over the years, I've been watching this show on TV called For All Mankind, which is like an alternative history that if the Russians would have landed on the moon first and the space race would have continued on up until our modern day, how different society would be. So I started thinking, what would happen if they had, TV at the time of the Holland Fire? Or what if they had TikTok at the time of the Holland Fire? How would they have covered it differently than they do now, than they did at the time? So we're going to take a look at the Holland Fire, how it was covered in print, how it would be covered on the radio and TV, and if the internet was around, and social media. So we're going to kind of go through the Holland Fire first with looking at it, how it was covered in print, and then move on. But before we start, a little bit about myself. I recently started spending a lot of time here in Holland. My fiance lives up here. I'm from Kalamazoo originally, so started to spend a lot more time up here. And one of the first things I did after I proposed, and she said yes, was get a subscription to the Holland Sentinel, because I wanted to learn more about the community. And it was a reminder for me how important local media is. I got into journalism at Western Michigan University. I was studying Latin and Greek. Kind of got tired of hanging out at the library all day and wanted to write stuff that was happening now. So I worked at the Western Herald, which led me to an internship at the Kalamazoo Gazette and a short, 5-6 year career at MLive at the Kalamazoo Gazette before I went to the dark side of marketing at Bell's Brewery. But I guess, Bell's is a pretty good company, so we shouldn't really call it the dark side. We do have some dark beers. But let's get in and talk about the Holland Fire, just kind of lay some groundwork for what the fire is. So in the summer of 1871, extreme drought conditions throughout the Midwest. One newspaper said it was a powder keg kind of getting ready to explode. In October 8th, strong winds were coming, and from my research at the time, there's a lot of farmers and they would just burn brush. Which my dad does all the time now in the city of Kalamazoo, and the cops they come and he's like, well, I don't know, I'm just burning some brush. So I guess it's a tradition that keeps going. So some brush was burning, the winds came, a fire broke out in the woods south of Holland, and then spread to the city. About 2/3 of the city was destroyed, and 300 families were left homeless. When I was walking around downtown tonight, just imagining what that destruction could look like, and it was hard to imagine. So at the time, print media was around, newspapers were around. You see some of the information in the Newsflash exhibit. But here's what a front page of a Holland newspaper looked like in 1872. This was the earliest newspaper I could find in the Hope College archives. And as you can tell, print was, it kind of gives you a sense. Lots of text, lots of black and white print, and lots of information. So when we think about what newspapers were at that time, I really like to refer to it as like the internet of the day for people who could read. When we think about everything we do on the internet today, we log in, we see what our friends are doing, we look up what's happening in the community. That all happened in the local newspaper. And at the time, most newspapers were kind of partisan, right? There's a Democrat newspaper, a Republican newspaper. Different newspapers had different political leanings. Objectivity, as we know today, wasn't really a thing back then. Journalism ethics also weren't a thing. That was something that developed years later, but at the time, people were just trying to figure it out, and there weren't the standards of journalism that we have today. It was predominantly text and provided social commentary and opinions, and really in a lot of ways, if you think about newspapers and printed media in general, really had a huge influence during the Civil War. You think about the Civil War, all the battles happened down south, but people in Michigan were able to hear what was happening, learn about slavery. Print was a huge thing in the abolition movement. So we kind of see the importance of media and print media during that time. So what kind of things did you see in the newspaper? So this is from that front page that I just showed. We had a business directory, a train schedule, some fiction. This was around the holidays, so it was a story called The Wrong Stocking. There was some local news, including, this was around Christmas, the Methodist Church Society had a Christmas tree gathering, which proved a success. Everything passed off pleasantly and to the satisfaction of all interested. Very exciting. Sounds like a Facebook post we might see today. Classifieds. Someone's trying to sell his house on 12th Street, but he says, "I'm selling it. Come get some more details from me." This ad cracked me. This is all just from one newspaper, right? I didn't go through the archives that deep, but this is, there's great excitement in Holland. Where? The city bakery. And this part cracks me. The public wants our goods and we want their money. Talk about some honest advertising we have there. So throughout tonight, as we look through the different examples, I'm going to share some kind of media concepts that I think are really important, some journalism concepts. And the first one is informing the public, right? One of the reasons that I got involved in journalism was I could go to a board of trustees meeting at Western, sit through all processing and talk and everything like that, and figure out what was really happening and what was affecting students on campus. And I kind of felt like it was my, being like a martyr almost, sitting through these boring meetings and digging through the facts and everything, but providing something for people to help out. So this is a cornerstone of media, and specifically journalism, how we inform the public. And when we think about informing the public, we should think about the importance of audience, right? All communication is based on the sender and the receiver. So tonight I'm providing information, and when I was putting together this presentation, I thought a lot about who might be here tonight and the type of information that I could do. The same is true in journalism. And we think about that in different types of publications, right? We have local news, regional and state news, national news, and international news. So how the Holland Sentinel would cover a story that happens in Holland would be different than the Detroit Free Press and the New York Times. They have different audiences. They have different ways of explaining things. Someone who might be reading about something that happens in Detroit doesn't, they're in Florida, they might not know the history of Michigan, or they might not care that much about the specific details about where things happen. So this is going to be important as we kind of look at how the Holland Fire was covered at the time. So let's transport back in time, Monday, October 9th, 1871 at 2 a.m. The city of Holland is on fire. Most of the city is aflame. And we go to the next day. The next day is newspaper. Was there any local news in Holland, I think? Does anyone? Yeah, okay, yeah. It was a while ago, wasn't it? There was not, because all of the local newspapers burned down, right? Except for one, which I'll get to in a minute. The 3 local Dutch newspapers burned down. I think there's an English one as well. They caught on fire and burned down. But amazingly enough, that same day, October 9th, hours after the fire started, just over, and I'll say it's regional in Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids Daily Eagle had some information about the Holland Fire, which I just think is amazing. I don't know if someone got on a horse and buggy and went over there. Telegraphs were around, but I'm sure everything in Holland was on fire. And it was fascinating to read there. This was the whole account that they had. And they say, "We regret to learn that considerable property has been destroyed in the vicinity of the Holland settlement, and that Grafenchef, I'm horrible at pronunciations, apologies, Allegan County, that many fences and several houses, barns, and other buildings have been consumed by fire." Clearly, they don't know the full extent of what happened, right? That they're talking about fences being caught on fire. Just wait, but we see this today, right? We see this oftentimes in news where, you hear of something happening and it might be an under-exaggeration or an over-exaggeration of what happened. I remember I was very young at the time, but on 9/11, hearing, 10,000 people, are dead, and that was something that we thought was true. But they had no idea, right? It's the best information you have at the time. So then we look the next day in the Grand Rapids Daily Eagle. There was some news here that one man, a clergyman, but they don't know what denomination he was. Remember, this is West Michigan, so it's very important information. His wife and one or two children are reported death. Our informant did not know whether Hope College was burned or not, but feared that it was. Is there any local history buffs in here who can pick up on anything right here? Well, there was, I left. Yeah, so Hope College was untouched in the fire for the most part. There's later fires later on, and there was only amazingly one death in this fire, which is just kind of wild to think about. But here you have a clergyman, some other people, so clearly they have this informant, whoever this informant is. And I think that's an interesting thing too. Today, oftentimes there's anonymous sources, but as a reporter, you have to be pretty solid on anonymous sources with it. But clearly, this was the way things were, back then. So we go, that same day was the first bit of news in the Detroit Free Press, right? And this is all that they had. They dispatched at 4 o'clock this morning, says, the village of Holland, Ottawa County was entirely destroyed today. That's all they had. Really, that's most of what they had about the Holland fire. Because at the same time, there was big fires in the Thumb, Port Huron area, and clearly they were more interested in that. I mean, rightfully so. I mean, imagine the distance between Holland and Detroit back in 1871. Different sides of the state, but really different sides of the country. So they reported on it, but didn't get into a lot of details. Probably because they didn't have a lot of it, but their audience might not cared about it. So here, October 12th, a few days after, we got our first sense of local news from De Hope. And at first, when I heard this, I thought it was like a really hip, like a really hip newspaper name from back then, because it was the newspaper of Hope College. But when I went to the archives at Hope College yesterday, down to the microfilm, and pulled this up, I realized, it's in Dutch. And my Dutch isn't that good, but we hear Holland was on his night, which my translation, I already knew what it was. Holland was and is not. Holland's disaster, days of anxiety, wanton suffering. Our mind refuses to think clearly, and our hands to write the particulars of the fearful, tragic events that befall us. The Almighty has spoken, right? These are very, they're writing it, from the people who lived here. They're writing for their audience in Holland. We go further. They're talking about the events that happened during the fire. Nevertheless, there seemed to be no danger for us, right? Sunday afternoon, there's a storm. Didn't seem like a big problem. Still, it seemed that the danger threatening the surrounding area is more than the city itself. It's not going to come here, right? We're good. It's not going to hit us. Having wind remain in that direction, Holland would still be here. And when I read this, it really kind of caught me, like, they're working through this right now. They're trying to come up with, justifications about how did we let this happen to our city? What happened? It's very something personal. The people are writing it, maybe not so much as journalists, but as people who lived through it. And this is a interesting part, so I got to give a shout out to this book, which really helped me out with this. This is a collection from Donald Van Rieken, where he went through and translated and collected so much of the Holland fire, kind of news clips and everything, and wrote it out, and very much typewriter, as you can tell. But this is all an inventory of everything that burned. Right? Everything that happened. And, the Free Press wouldn't be interested in that. Grand Rapids would be interested in that. But people in Holland really want to know what happened on the west side of River Street, about Mr. Russell's house. So it's fascinating that, when you think about local news, that's something that they really are interested in. Yeah?
The original listings of the original notes are all in the archives.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Yeah. So it's fascinating to see, this is something that's very, very local, right? About, what people are interested in. So we get one example of national news in the New York Times. This is what the New York Times looked like back in 1871. Any guesses on what page the Holland fire that destroyed an entire city was on? Yeah. It was on page 5. And it has this title, Fire Themed, right? Fearful sacrifice of human life. And, they still have that thing in Michigan, which the Times still has today, which I thought was really interesting to find. But, in Holland, on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, the flames made a clean sweep. Scarcely a building being left to suffering. People were promptly cared for by May, or the citizens of Grand Haven, Professor Charles Scott of Hope College Parish, also a minister whose name was not ascertained. That's it. And there's a couple instances where they talk about the Holland Fire afterwards, but they're mostly letters from people. So here's like a letter from someone in New York, a Zimmerman who has some connections to Holland, calling people and saying, hey, send donations, they need your help, they need the money. There was a whole thing with insurance that I'm not going to get into with the Holland Fire, but they were really trying to get people to send money to the community. So when you think about its print coverage in the years to come, right, so this is kind of base level of what the reporting was at the time, you know, from the time of 1871 further, photography became an important thing, right, showing people images of what happened. Longer in-depth feature stories, kind of those magazine stories, the things that like print readers really love, right, between 10,000 words. Special section and graphics, that's all the ways that print really evolved over the years. But we kind of see the base of what print journalism is back here. So let's move along to radio. The time of radio, how would the Holland Fire be covered in the radio? So at the time, radio, what was radio like? So I'm kind of thinking this is like 1937 that we're in right now, so imagine you're in 1937, Depression's kind of been around for a while, trouble in Europe. The first commercial radio station started in the 20s and expanded in the 30s, and it started off like so many of these new media that we see, started off as entertainment, right? Like what are people going to watch? They want to be entertained, and then developing news for that. And I think the big thing, you know, with what radio did was, you know, it brought people's voices, they could actually hear them. You know, I think an often example is like the fireside chats of FDR, where you could just not, you wouldn't just get the information from him, but you'd hear the president speaking. You know, Winston Churchill, you know, his speeches were really well known in England as well. And it kind of developed the personalities of broadcasters. At the time in print journalism, there weren't really bylines, it was just the newspaper's voice. But at the time, people kind of became those personalities. You think of Walter Cronkite and Earl Monroe, they kind of started with radio and became fixtures in people's homes. But the biggest thing is that news could become live, right? Be broadcast live. You didn't have to wait for the newspaper to be delivered. You could turn on a radio and hear what's happening at that moment. So this is the second concept of the importance of real-time news and reporting. I think we have some, you know, historic print readers in here. I grew up reading the newspaper, and do you all remember when you would sit down and like have a newspaper and look at it, and it was like a week old, and it was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do with this now. The importance of real-time news and reporting has been a cornerstone of journalism. You know, it gives people a sense of you want to know what's happening now, you want to know what's happening at this moment, and we see that today in modern media with kind of like refreshing your Twitter feed or wanting to see what the latest is and the latest that's going on. So when we think about the Holland Fire, what it would be like on the radio, so imagine we're in 1937, and there's a couple things like, since we're playing in this like fantasy-like world, okay, 1937, or you know the technology, the radio station's probably burned down. People aren't at home with their radios to listen, but let's just forget about that and imagine what it would be like on the radio. So the first type would be like a breaking news bulletin, right? So here's something, you'd have, good evening, this is Henry Van Dyke with WHTC News Holland Radio, interrupted our regular scheduled programming with an emergency bulletin. It's just after 2 o'clock in the morning, and we have come into the station to share word that most of the city is in flames. An evacuation order has been issued by Ottawa County Emergency Services. All residents are asked to leave as soon as possible. Do not go to structures to retrieve goods. So it's kind of that live, it's 2 a.m. in the morning, they're on the radio, something that print couldn't do. I only remember one time in my life that growing up in Kalamazoo, that they printed a special edition of the newspaper, and that was on 9/11. And they printed an afternoon paper and said, we have to get the news out right now. But radio, you just turn on the radio, and right there you have the latest and greatest, hopefully the greatest, my former days as a print journalist are showing through right now. You have the latest and greatest information there for you. And we also think about another thing that radio could do is kind of give those live updates. So kind of imagine a reporter is on the street, maybe just outside of here, with a, portable microphone saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is WXYZ reporting live from downtown Highland. There's a massive fire. It's hot. It's really hot. Right? It's funny listening to these old radio things. They were just telling it as it is, right? Because it was so new. The firefighters are helpless in the face of this inferno. They're also like all English majors, so they're all pretty flowery with their language. What is over here on 8th Street? Something that looks like a person is running out of a building on fire. Oh, the horror or the humanity. The wretched souls trapped in the buildings with no escape. The cries will haunt me eternally. God save us, right? A little tongue-in-cheek, because I mean, this is clearly adapted from the Hindenburg famous radio broadcast. But the sense that you can hear someone reacting to it live, right? It's not written down. You can hear it live and see what that person is going through. And we see that a lot today in TV as well. Another thing that radio could do is you can have a live press conference from the mayor, right? And I think this is a huge, important thing that media can offer is oftentimes, if there's a press conference or any type of dissemination of information, you have that media, that reporter as your gatekeeper almost, right? To like, here's the information that's important, but here's not everything. But I love turning on the TV and seeing like press conferences as they happen and kind of get the full story. So this is something that radio kind of allowed in a lot of ways to kind of see the news unfold live as you're there. So as we think about the advancements in radio over the years, World War II, huge, right, to get that information live to people, updates of what's happening over there. And technology advances a lot in global recording and broadcasting. We think about the local radio stations with their little trucks where they go around and broadcast live. But at the time to be somewhere and broadcast live or broadcast a feed from Washington, D.C. also was huge. In radio, as TV came in, it really allowed radio to develop news programming where, we think about NPR today, right? At least I know in Kalamazoo we now have 2 NPR stations, one for news and one for classical music. And really, kind of allows that place for news programming to develop. Also later on in the 1980s, a lot of place for people to share their opinions. I think of Rush Limbaugh, who for years and years had 3-4 hours on the radio every day just to talk. Not to be political, but it really changed the political makeup of our country, that you had that much airtime for folks to talk and share their stories. So now we're going to jump to television. I would say the golden age of television and television news. So what did TV kind of look like at its time? I would say TV news really started off as newsreels before the movies, where you could go and you could actually see what was happening, right? Which I think is such a huge and powerful thing. When you think about it, you can only hear or be told what was happening, you can actually see what things look like. And as more and more people got TVs in their house, news programming was added, much like radio. Nightly news broadcasts became a part of people's lives. Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow. Not so much today, but you think about the people you grew up watching. I know all the Channel 3 newscasters, like off the top of my head, growing up and watching them every night. They really become a part of the family and what's going on. And we look at like the 1960s, how TV news really changed people's views on things. Nixon, Kennedy debate, massive shift in that election because people could see young John Kennedy and sweaty Richard Nixon on TV. And the Vietnam War as well, that every night people saw those images of the Vietnam War in ways that they hadn't seen, maybe in World War II or other wars. It really changed the public's opinion on it. Cable news kind of expanded and allowed people to have niche media. If you're really interested in bass fishing, there's bass fishing TV. If you really like to repair your home and garden TV. If you really liked, the news, you can watch CNN all the time. If you like it was a little bit more conservative, there's Fox News, a little more liberal, MSNBC. So you can really kind of choose and get what you're doing. But the big thing is, you turn it on and you get the latest news, right? You see what's happening, you see what's going on. And it's a, big news junkie myself. I have CNN on like all day. I'm sure Lauren gets annoyed with it, but you always gotta wait for that breaking news thing. So our next concept, our kind of journalism cornerstone, is that journalism really gives voice to the voiceless, right? You think about, there's so many people in the world and so many institutions who don't have the ability to communicate their message or share their experience with others. And the media and journalism has always been there to share the experiences of other people. So we think about people who are going through, impoverished. You might know that there's people who are, poor in your community. You hear those stories in the newspaper of their struggles and what they go through. Really puts a voice with the name. I think a great example of that is, when we think about different, not a great example in the sense that it's good, but an example that illustrates it is when there's wars that happen, that happen on the other side of the world. We aren't affected by it, but when we watch the news and see what happens and here's the stories of people, we can really understand that. Someone who's studying Latin and Greek, you hear about these big battles in ancient Rome and ancient Greece and tens of thousands of people and all these deaths, and it's hard to imagine. When you hear that story of that one person, that can really stick with you. That's something really important that journalism and the media has done. So back to the Holland Fire. What would it look like reporting the news live from the Holland Fire? I think we've all watched breaking news, in our lives, where they have multiple reporters just standing there waiting to go on the air, talking to people, trying to find the different angles of different stories, and all of that would happen here as well. But also, TV, they like to interview kids, right? Like they always like the good kid interview, and maybe they want to do it tonight with the Holland Fire. But again, this is all just imagination, right? So we're just going to imagine that that the local TV station interviews this 9-year-old named Al K, because you can't use kids' last names without those. So Al K, right? So the reporter says, now we have 9-year-old Al who just escaped from the flames with his family. Al, what happened? Yeah, it's really scary. There's a big fire everywhere. My great-grandpa's hardware store near the bank is on fire. My sidewalk streets were all on fire. It's super scary. We're glad you and your family were able to get out alive. Al continues. My dad came in and woke me up and he said we had to leave fast. He told us to grab whatever we can. He put our sewing machine in our house buggy and covered it with quilts. My mom was really worried. She has this watch she always wears and it's worth a lot of money. Well, I'm glad they all got out safely. It was really, really scary. The fire was everywhere. Dad drove the buggy really fast through the streets. We had to stop because the quilts got on fire. Dad buried our sewing machine in a sandhill because he said it would keep it safe. Well, Al, that's all the time we have. And Grandpa is really funny. My dad told him to take something important out of the store, and he brought a popcorn popper and a bird cage. And the bird cage didn't even have a bottom. Now that's something to smile about, bringing you back to the studio. So the fun thing about this is actually a true story from Al Kleiss, who survived the Holland Fire. He gave his first person, memory of it in 1974, and an audio interview with the Herod Public Library, and all those little details. Like, I had been studying this for a couple of weeks, and when I read that, thinking about a buggy going down 8th Street, and the quilts, our family heirlooms were catching on fire, and the sparks were everywhere. And the moment of humor of Grandpa, go get something important out of the store, and he brought a popcorn popper, which, hey, I love some popcorn, and a bird cage with the bottom of it. Was there a bird in there? I don't know. It gives you these details that really humanize the story. And that's something so important that journalism does. It's kind of humanize that. So what other type of TV coverage could there be for the Holland Fire, right? A lot. Weather, of course, we're seeing that right now on the news. They would be all over it with weather. Keith Thompson of 1871 would be there. Facebook Live, if the internet was around. Health and safety, TV news is, out of all the different media, TV news has historically been very much like, what do you care about? What do the citizens care about? What can we do to impact the most people? Which is great in a lot of ways. On the ground reporting, eyewitnesses, interview with experts. I always crack up watching CNN. They always have an expert for everything. So you probably have the CNN fire marshal expert come in, emergency response. They would get people in there to kind of put it in perspective. We'd also see a lot of human interest stories as well. And today, a lot of viewer captured content as well. People sending their videos. We see that a lot on the local news where people send their sunset photos or rainbow photos. Megan from Cassopolis, sending here. So there'd be a lot of that. There'd be a lot of that as well. But the thing that I started thinking about with the Holland Fire for being covered on broadcast TV is how much of the fire would the local stations actually cover? It's kind of a trick question. Does anyone have any thoughts? Like, would they be on 24/7? Would they come in through certain programming? So this is an answer I don't really know because, as many of you know, there's another national news event that was happening the same night. The Chicago fire, right? And a lot of these local TV stations, still to this day, are owned by larger companies. They have a CBS affiliation, ABC, NBC affiliation. They often will come in and, if there's a big national story, they'll come in and take over the airwaves and broadcasting. And I don't know if they would have, if there's a local story the size of the Holland fire, if they would let Holland continue to cover it, or if they would come in with news from the Chicago fire, interspersed with the local stuff. But that's something to consider, right? That when there's a national story, TV takes over. But one thing that I think is super interesting in Channel 8, when TV does this, the rise of digital media and all the secondary stations they have. I think Channel 8, like One TV, has like 4 or 5 stations now on the air, allows them to do their local reporting in unison with the national reporting. So they've done this for the last couple of years when like a gubernatorial election or local elections, that on the main NBC channel, the main Channel 8 channel, they'll have the national news desk, right, talking about elections all over the place. But then on like the CW or the local station online, they'll have all their local reporters throughout the state reporting from Sri Tanadar's headquarters in Metro Detroit, or Gretchen Whitmer's party. So they have kind of do the big national coverage locally. I find that totally amazingly valuable. So don't know, just something to consider as we think about it, right? All right, now we're going to get to the internet. And this is where I kind of came in as a journalist when I started working at Online in the Gazette around 2010. I came in right when the presses stopped running and we really focused on being a digital-first newsroom. So we did not have computers like this. I should have used a better computer to represent the time. It's for dramatic effect, like a lot of the things here. So brief history of internet news. Oops. News on the web started out as newspapers posting their just articles to it, right? Nothing different, just what they had in print, you would copy and paste. I did that a lot in my early career. Go on the old, news system, copy and paste it in there. Radio stations and TV stations would take their scripts. And it was always funny back, 2005, 2006, to 2012, to go on the TV stations, and it was very much like what the reporter read on stage. It wasn't made for the internet. And the newspaper stuff wasn't either. But as the internet kind of became the place, where the first coverage began to develop, and we started trying to think of ways, what's the best way to report this news online? We can update the stories as they come, so we can constantly update the stories. Or maybe there's more interactive ways that we can tell the story. A poll, we can ask people a poll question, right? So we're really playing around with all the technology that the internet provides. But I think the big thing is when we think about the media landscape, is that at the time, newspapers had their readers and they were set. Radio had their listeners, they were set. TV had their people. And they all kind of have their own lanes, right? Almost like the agreement. We all got our people, but once it went on the internet, they all started competing with each other, right? One website is the same as another website. So everyone was sharing news on that same platform. So it really kind of changed the landscape where, folks who worked at a TV station need to learn how to write a little bit better maybe, or have better writing on the website. And folks on the print side like me had to get our little flip cameras and go out to scenes and try to make videos. And now we kind of see this whole digital world where everyone does a little bit of everything. But geography is no longer a barrier in a lot of ways, right? You think about before the internet, if you wanted to get certain information, you had to maybe go to a library to get that. Radio had a certain amount of radios that would broadcast to. I remember when I interned at the Jackson Citizen Patriot, my mom, and she's a web savvy user, so if she's watching, I'm not trying to call you out, but she was so into print that she got a subscription to the Citizen Patriot shipped to her house. So every day they would put the newspaper in the mail, and she would get it to read the newspaper, and it'd be like 2 or 3 days late. That was something that folks did back then as well. The internet kind of leveled that. And also allowed more voices to be heard. They really allowed, new news organizations to come up. I think about like ProPublica is one of them. that really does specialized news reporting that traditional news outlets maybe wouldn't have the time to do or the investment to do. And I think, when I talked before about how that print newspaper was like the internet of the time, at least in the print world, you think about what your old Grand Rapids Press was, you had, sports scores, you had TV Guide. That was a big reason that people bought it, was for the TV Guide. I remember in 2011, it was the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and I did 3 feature stories of local people in Kalamazoo who had been involved in 9/11. There was a psychologist who went out there and offered counseling, so I followed him 10 years later. There was a group of firefighters in Paw Paw, Michigan, who, down at the station heard, the attacks, got in their fire truck and drove to New York to help out. And they were some of the last groups that allowed them to help out with the recovery. And a woman whose son had passed away, and he was killed in the Twin Towers. So I worked, I was young at the time, maybe early 20s, and was really, reporting on it, and was really proud of my work, and, working day and night, I had about a week and a half to do it. So that next day, it was a Sunday, 9/11/2011, I went down to the Michigan News Agency, which is kind of like Reader's World in Kalamazoo. I was buying all the front pages of the newspapers, and there was my front page right there. 3 stories on the front page of the Sunday paper, right? I was feeling pretty proud of my work, and talking to the guys who worked at the shop, and this woman came in, and she said, "I'll have the Kalamazoo Gazette, please." And I was like, okay, this is it. This is what it's all about. She gave me the $2 or whatever. She got the newspaper, opened it up, took the ads on it, threw the paper in the trash. And that's when I realized, people don't read when they buy the newspaper, they don't buy it for the reasons that I do. That was a big kind of wake-up call for a lot of us when we all had the TVs installed in the newsrooms. They had the page views. Imagine your newspaper was at a circulation of 40,000, and you spend all this time working on a story, and then you see only 1,000 people looked at the story, right? It's like, well, when we had 40,000 subscribers, circulation of 40,000, maybe 38,000 people read the stories. They got it for the TV Guide, they got it for the comics, they got it for all the other things. And maybe they were exposed to the news, right? Maybe when they got it, they could see what's on there, move on. But people are motivated for different ways to buy the newspaper. And we see that today with the internet, right? Like, what are the trending stories? Taylor Swift might have more interest than President Biden, a lot of those different things. So when we think about our next concept is fact-checking, right? Core to what journalism is, right? When you read something in the newspaper, you think it's true. But journalism really is that first draft of history, right? We're trying to figure it out, trying to get it right. I go back, you think you go back and look at stories as they're developing, you don't have the context, right? But it's the best information you have at the time, and you're reporting it and trying to get it out there. But when we read news today, let's go back maybe 8 years. 8 years ago, we thought that most of the news was pretty right? Maybe some things would be wrong, but we had faith in it. Now I think it's been politicized quite a bit, but fact-checking is huge in the world of journalism. And I think the internet has brought that forward, but also taken us a few steps back, right? If you read something in the newspaper, how often do you read something or hear something and you go on Google to look it up right away, right? Or go to Wikipedia or ChatGPT. But you go in and you're fact check. So that's great to allow more people to look things up and fact check, but it also allows more people to put out information that might be incorrect, right? We hear about that a lot where someone looks it up on the internet and it's on the internet, so it must be true. So, 2 steps forwards, maybe 2 steps back in a lot of ways. But if the Holland fire is covered on the internet today, I have an example here from the New York Times of a recent story. I didn't want to go through and, we've kind of covered a lot of the Holland fire information, so I'm taking a little break from that. But this was just on the New York Times website just the other night, the winter storms. I'm sure the website looks very similar right now, but it's a developing story, right? So in the past, kind of when internet news started off, you would think of the big, long stories you see in the New York Times that has all the information, right, kind of the daily recap. And a lot of news organizations do this, but I think the Times kind of visually has the best. Where you have like your topic, winter storms, right? You know, updated 12 minutes ago. And as you go through, they have, you know, a story kind of describing everything that happened. What's the latest? What's the summary of what's happening? And as you scroll down here, you get, you know, some information, you know, just a quick update. So you have a tweet from the National Weather Service in South Carolina, and then the reporter who's covering it has a short snippet, right? So it's kind of like the reporter's notebook. As they get information they can verify, they share it in real time. And I think this is really important, and we'll talk about social media in a minute, but this is a great way to go and kind of get that feed of the latest information. And you know the New York Times, hopefully, or a news organization like the Wall Street Journal, isn't going to have this information on it. They're going to check it, so that it's a trusted source that you can go to. Well, something else you can do on the internet is I saw this tweet, and I was like, oh, tornado, let me look it up. Within, you know, a minute, I was on the local South Carolina news website to kind of get some additional information if that was something I was interested in, right? So the ability to not only hear what's happening in the world, but go to the source and actually see what's going on is quite amazing to kind of fact check and see what's going on. So you get graphics like this, which you see the Holland fire, right? You actually have an interactive graphic there. But when we think about the future of internet news, I don't have to necessarily, you know, it's a kind of rhetorical question, because we have it with social media, right? But you might be asking, isn't the internet news and social media kind of the same thing? Well, they are and they aren't. I would say the difference is when I think about internet news, it's from publishers like the New York Times, while social media is just publishers like the New York Times, reporters, and everyone else in this room, and all of your cousins and friends, and posting information. It's a big soup of information. So quick social media history, you know, started off in the early 2000s. Like with every media, news ended up finding its place. It was really started off as a place for reporters to break news and share information. You know, we think about all the tweets that are shared on the news and kind of that live information. But it's also allowed politicians, businesses, governments to communicate directly with their constituents, right? I think about the 2008 Obama campaign as a real watershed moment in this. Obama got a lot of free media, but he was also able to connect directly with voters across the country through social media. And it really democratized the power of the internet for people to publish. So we think about social media and the ability to personalize a newsfeed. I'm sure if we all came up here, everyone had a smartphone and it's on Facebook or Instagram, our feeds would look totally different from one another, right? Where with the newspaper and radio and TV, we would have a shared definition of what the news was. You know, my front page of the Holland Sun would be the same as all of your front pages. Social media is totally different, right? You know, the news I'm interested in and the news sources I go to are totally different, which is the reason why when I came here, I made sure to follow the Holland Sentinel reporters and you know, subscribe to the local news up here to make sure I'm exposed to it, because it's not going to show up on my doorstep anymore. So this is something to keep in mind as we look at social media and think about how it's different, and algorithms give us, you know, what we want. So the Holland fire and social media. So I have some tweets here. So it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, October 8th. This reporter, Garrett, reports, this is his name. Strangest weather today, like ash snowing outside, hashtag Holland City. Here reports of trees burning southwest of town. We'll stay on top of it, hashtag drought 71. Because you would assume the drought is a big story that there's hashtags across the country. Garrett reports, comes back, drought-stricken woods around Holland City, showing signs of fire, lots of smoke and distance. Fire department just sent out a press release that they are on high alert. He's continuing to follow the story. You know, reporter, great, this is internet news, right? Now we get the Holland City fire account sharing out. Fires are being reported around the city. We're working with both Allegan and Ottawa County officials to make sure they're contained. We'll post updates here as our main source of information. So they're using it oftentimes, police and fire emergency folks will say, this is the spot where we're gonna post updated information. This is the source of truth. This is where we're posting all of our updates. And now we have the New Holland Soda Co., a predominant business on October 8th of 1871, because I think Holland may have been dry back then, I'm not sure. I guess that's a national fact check. So it's not New Holland Brewery, but New Holland Soda Co. They share out on their social media, due to threats of the fire surrounding the city, we're closing early tonight and will reopen tomorrow at 3 p.m. Please be safe out there, everyone. Right? So it allows companies to have that same platform as other people. Now we get a tweet from Real Holland Patriot. I've never heard of him before, but his tweets get some attention. And he says, reliable sources tell us that the fires are being started in the wooded areas surrounding Holland by a faction of Confederates for Michigan in an attempt to raise awareness for their cause, developing. Boy, that sounds pretty scary, right? Some Michigan Confederates are starting fires to protest. 8 o'clock. We have the Holland City Fire continue to monitor the situation on the City of Holland. Please stay calm and stay tuned. Garrett reports has an update a half an hour later. Winds picking up, concern growing over potential fire spread in Holland City. The police and fire are urging caution. Okay, things are picking up a little bit. Holland Soda Co. The fires on top of our pop shop. So they are able to, like, this is the thing that was so interesting with social media when news develops like that. They got a location downtown. They can get up on their roof. They have access to share it out. So kind of that user-generated content, right? Garrett report says the wind, it's screaming outside. As any reporting, it looks like he fell asleep, dozed off for a bit and woke me up. Kind of that personal story. And then he says, seeing a mountain of flames at the cannery outside my window, heading out to check out what's going on. Shortly after, we have the Real Holland Patriot says, why are the fires allowed to spread? Firefighters were seen sitting around at the station while the fire spreads with a picture of, we don't know when the picture was taken, but some pictures of some firefighters sitting outside of the Holland Museum, but we don't know. And then we have 8th Street Happenings, which is a kind of like a fashion blog. There's a lot of cool shops downtown Holland. There were back then too. The fire seems to get closer. People are freaking out. Why hasn't the city issued an evacuation order yet, right? So people get to share and talk about the concerns that they have. Half an hour later, Holland City says evacuation order for downtown Highland. Fire spreading rapidly to the north. Firefighters trying to contain the blaze. Please behind, right? So it's the ability for the local municipalities to communicate directly, in real time, that you don't do with printers and the other ones. And oftentimes, the evacuation order came a little bit late, but still in the area. Now for the top of the talk, a few days later, we're on TikTok. With the TikTok, do you know why the Holland fire actually spread? This is from C. Penoir 62. And just imagine this in TikTok. I was going to use some AI to make videos, but they weren't that good. I was there when the Holland fire broke out. People told me they couldn't put out the fire because it was Sunday and would go against the TV. This is the real life impact Christianity has on people, right? 8.9 million views seen across the country, across the world, right? And we see this a lot today, right? Like, clearly, not, like doesn't seem to be true. It comes out days later. But we see this today. We see TikTok in the news where people, we were talking earlier about, what was his name? Who would read the front page of the Sentinel on the radio?
Oh, read
Yeah.
You read it on the radio.
He'd read the front page on the radio. And one of the big trends on TikTok right now is people will read the front page of the New York Times. Yeah. I think the New York Times is like, it's great, people are reading it, but hey, you can subscribe over here. But also misinformation is also rampant. There was a thing a couple months ago where all these TikTok influencers just like, so I'm reading this thing called The Letter to America. And it's making me think different about America and the way we approach things. And the Letter to America they were referring to was written by Osama bin Laden. And it spread across TikTok. And it was just this thing of like misinformation and, questioning about were these people paid to do it, unknown, or were they just trying to get views, right? It was a trending topic on TikTok and people would do anything to get those likes. But we have one here on October 13th from, looks like it's from Grand Haven where she filmed it. And then later that day, we have Real Holland Patriot come in. TikTok eyewitness shows the real reason Holland fires able to spread. There's more to this story. Join our discussion in Telegram. Which Telegram is a kind of like a chat app that it's kind of like where free speech is allowed in all ways, and it's a place that the QAnon conspiracies spread in the last couple of years. But this shows that people are able to take this and use it as a catapult to get people on different channels. So this is October 13th. A few days later, our friend Garrett reports this here. He says, Holland Fire, local pastors weigh in on Sabbath claims. A couple days after that, Holland City Fire. The claims that our firefighters didn't do anything in their power to fight out the horrific flames that destroyed our city are preposterous, right? But these are days later, and they don't have anywhere to reach that TikTok video had, right? And what are people going to remember when they think about that TikTok video? Now, I'm not saying everything on TikTok is incorrect, but my question for you is, how much of what I shared, besides being on TikTok, how much of it was made up? No, it was not actually. So there was a lot of misinformation back in 1871. So the C. Pennywall, her name was Kara, there's these two sisters who were teachers in Holland who lived up in Grand Haven, were born in Grand Haven. So the fire happened, they got out of Dodge, they went back to Grand Haven, and they were interviewed by the local Grand Haven newspaper, and they started that story. They said, oh yeah, they didn't put the fire out because it was a religious, it was Sunday, religious holiday. They mentioned all those people who died. Remember all those people earlier in the newspaper that I said, the Hope professor, the pastor, that all came from them, right? They spread the misinformation, and since Holland's newspapers were burned, they couldn't get their own story out for a couple of days. There was also some other misinformation that came out, that Hollanders wouldn't work to help clean up the fire unless they were paid. That was something that came out. Many people died, and that Hollanders didn't want to pay the insurance because of religious obligations. So this is all misinformation that was being spread around, and it's all true. So it just kind of, I think, goes to show, and we have some information here where after that came out in the Grand Rapids Daily paper, the writer said, that this is disgraceful, and it's misinformation, that we've gone missing, that this is really bad, we can't get our story out. This misinformation and slander caused Holland much grief. The chief rumor, refused to fight the fire. Like, this was something that, and here's where they go on to talk about those two sisters. But I think it shows that how misinformation can even spread back then. And so those outrageous claims that we kind of thought, when I thought were made up, are really, really happened back then. So I think a lot of it is, as we think about the future of news and kind of like print and radio, and there's been all these technological advancements, but a lot of the issues that we deal with today were issues back in 1871. Misinformation, getting that information out. So as we think going forward with, journalism, what's important, informing the public and media see, giving voice to the voiceless, personalized news and fact checks are really going to be some of the things that are going to be important for us as we think of the news going forward. So I'm all done. I just wanted to give a thanks to the Holland Fire, the book I mentioned, Holland, Michigan, the big 3-volume there. All the books by Larry Massey, Hope College, have the Holland Museum. So we'll open up for questions now. So.
Thank you, Fritz. That was amazing. Are there any questions? And I will pass the microphone around so we can be sure everybody hears the question. So does anybody have any questions for Fritz?
Or any historical inaccuracies that I had? I was a history major in college, but I was back at it. I was like, oh boy, I don't know, my chops are still up.
No, I think so. Oh, there's a question over there. Hold on.
At first, when you were talking about newspapers, you were talking about, that people could be informed, at least people could read.
Yeah.
And then as it went on, like with radio, of course, you didn't have to read. You could just hear,
Listen,
if you
yeah.
understood the language, you could understand. And even as like the internet, like at first you were talking about the internet just having all that information like the newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
But now like TikTok, I think you don't even have to read to, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
back to the not having to read to really get both the information.
I mean, I don't want to sound like a TikTok pessimist, but you don't have to even think. And I hear this from my students, I hear it from people I work with, I hear from a lot of people out there, it's like, they'll get on TikTok and, 3 hours go by, right? And, the feed, and there's a lot of great news articles out there, just how it's so addictive, right? And it gets you going, scrolling. And I think the big thing kind of like with misinformation, especially as we go into the next election, right? And this is going to be an election of misinformation and deep fakes as well. Like the stuff that you do with deep fakes, you can have Trump or Biden or anyone say anything, right? And you can tell that it's fake when you watch it. And I think the big concern is if you see it all the time, and it's always in your peripheral vision, that all of a sudden you're going to think it's true, right? This happens to me all the time when I see things on Facebook and I just kind of see, I'm not really thinking about it, and I talk to someone and I'm like, oh yeah, this thing happened. Like, no, it didn't. And I was like, I saw it on Facebook, and I look it up and realize that I wasn't paying attention because we get so much information every day on the internet. But yeah, the ability to, I think that's a huge thing with TV as well, right? That, people don't have to have the skills, but I think media literacy is more important than ever to kind of know what's good or what's not, and, there's not a lot of places that teach it. Yeah, that's a good question.
Bring the microphone right here. I'll get up a little closer.
They can simulate voices from real people. I'm just wondering how concerned you are about that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern because it's unlike anything we've heard before, right? And I think the amount of misinformation. I remember a couple of months ago, I was on Twitter, and it was like, Saturday night football games across the country, and I saw on Twitter that it was a picture of Spartan Stadium before the game, and it was like a quiz, and it said, what country was Adolf Hitler born in? And it said Austria, and they had a picture of Hitler, like a very propaganda picture of Hitler saluting. I was like, this is made up. There's no way that that Michigan State University would allow this on the Jumbotron before the game. So I didn't share it, right? Because it was from like a Bleacher Reports, from kind of like a journalistic site I didn't really trust. And then I waited a couple hours, and then Graham Couch, the trustworthy reporter from the LSJ, tweeted about it, and it was all out there. But it was something where, like, in the past, I might have been a little bit more willing to share it, but I was like, no, I don't know, I'm going to wait to see what people I trust do. But I think it's huge, but also, like, from a reporter standpoint, is I got stuff wrong. We all got stuff wrong. And I remember there was an instance where, actually, I'm curious, has anyone in here, would you consider yourself, have you been interviewed by a reporter or a news story, or you had experience maybe where you're a subject expert and you read a news article based on that subject you're an expert in? Anyone? Okay, we got one right here. Yeah. Sometimes when you read stuff, it's like, oh, well, they got it 80% right, but there's some stuff that they didn't get right. And that's part of the game, right? Like, I think that's always been a part of journalism. The journalists I know work tirelessly. Should be paid a lot more money than what they are. But they're humans, right? They're not right 100% of the time. So I think it's always having that speculation, right? Always having that thing where it's like, oh, I don't know, that seems too good to be true, or I don't know if I trust that. But it's tough because we don't have. It takes a lot of time, right, to do so. Yeah. Then we'll go back here. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, okay.
You said there were 2 radio stations in Kalamazoo. We're familiar with them. 102.1, but what is the other call letters for the classical music?
It used to be the Loy North's radio station that they had, 89.9, I think is classical. You'd have to check that. If you go to WMUK.org, they'll have it where it is now.
I find it all very frustrating because a long time ago, if a reputable journalist was going to publish or anything or say anything, they had to have 3 sources behind them. And today they have nothing. And what do they teach them in journalism school today?
Yeah, I don't know. So I'm a proud not journalism school graduate. Well, just in the sense that, I studied history and Latin and Greek and kind of learned research there, and then worked at the student newspaper, kind of learned on there. So I don't know specifically what they're teaching there, but, in my experience, I know I kind of came in at the end of the print days where you needed that to the online days where it's immediate and got to get something up, you're competing with TV, and sourcing is still really important. One of my favorite memories was there was a big case in Southwest Michigan that had national news, and we're watching TV at 11, and Channel 3 got the news that someone was charged in it. It was the Doug Stewart, Venus Stewart case, if anyone's familiar with that from years ago. And I was there in the news, and we were like, shoot, they got it. How did they get this information, right? And we weren't going to report off of what Channel 3 did, so my editor came over, Mickey, and he was like, okay, so I was working the night desk. He said, okay, so we don't have the phone number for the St. Joseph County prosecutor attorney, but we have the home phone number for his fiancee. And this is at 11:10 at night, and they're getting married in a week. So here's the number. So I was 22, called him up. Hello? And that's yes. Did you do this? Yes, I'll never call this number again. But sourcing is super important. But I think having the 3 sources, like that was the rule for the longest time. The news moves so fast that as the standards have changed a little bit. I don't know particularly what they're doing now, but I don't think it's 3 sources.
It's not. I mean, there are no standards.
Well, I think a lot of people still have standards of what they're doing, but when things move fast, so that they're still sourcing. But you see different publications have different standards for what they'll do.
You asked what our experience was, if we had been interviewed or quoted or misquoted in the paper years ago. When I was a student at Wayne State University, I was misquoted in the Detroit Free Press in a demonstration that took place on campus. And what the paper said, I said, was that it lacked pizzazz. That word wasn't even in my vocabulary. But it has been ever since.
Yeah.
It was a growth experience.
Yeah, I will say to give some hope on that, and so I saw a lot of friends who are in the industry, and I was there kind of where it happened, where we went from writing down people's quotes to having these little recorders that you buy at Best Buy for $80, right? And now with the phones, you just hold it up to get the things, you write down the numbers. And now with AI voice transcription, you do it, you get the transcription in 10 minutes, and you're able to be more accurate with what people say. But that's the thing, I remember just, the worst feeling in the world was getting something wrong. And one thing that I don't miss about being a journalist was that feeling where you put a story out there and that night, it's like a Saturday night, you're out with friends, and you can't stop thinking about it, right? You like, did I get it right? Was I fair? And it's tough. I don't know in that case, but I know a lot of reporters feel really bad about that. I did, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they're trying to, you're a Wayne State student, they're trying to make you seem more educated with pizzazz. Yeah.
I have something to say in relation to that. Even though many of you remember me from the Sentinel from the 2000s, after my time with them, I went to help out with the Michigan Association of Railroad Passengers, which is the state advocacy group for the passenger rail. And we're helping Amtrak with an event called National Train Day. So we're having an event in Niles, Michigan. There comes the TV news out of South Bend, Indiana. And they spell my last name incorrectly on television. How I found out, of course, the internet, you can watch the replay of it. And I said, my last name ends with an S, not a Z. And I said, even I gave them my business card, and they still can't spell my name right. But then in relation to how you had News 3, and the Sentinel had News 8 at the time, and they used to call it the Lake Shore Link.
Oh yeah.
6 o'clock every night, and sometimes they're mainly there Monday through Friday. I'm working the weekends. We had news that occurred during the weekend that they wanted to feature, where there was a lady that was at the 26th Street Railroad crossing. She was on the crossing. Here came the train, and Good Samaritan saw her and tried to get her away from the track, and the train still hit her. And News 8 wasn't there, and they said, we heard what happened, so can we feature it on television? We did.
Yeah.
But this was back in the film days. The digital camera hasn't come out yet at the time, so the only way how we get the photos, they showed it on television. Thankfully, they got the photo credit right. because they were about to say Grand Rapids Press. I said, you were at the Sentinel, not Grand Rapids Press.
They're probably a big rivalry, we always had.
That was that time, yeah.
Yeah, and when I was at the Gazette, even within Booth, we were the same newspapers. The Gazette covered Southwest Michigan, and the Grand Rapids Press covered that. But in Allegan, it was kind of like the no man's land where you go into the gas station. Still think today you can. And you see both the Kalamazoo Gazette and Grand Rapids Press. So we'd always spar over that. Battle Creek was for us in the Jackson Citizen Patriot, right? Like that area. So fun stuff.
Any other questions? Okay, all right. Thank you again, Fritz, for being here. Well, I would not. And thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. You can check out for a few minutes the new splash exhibit on your way out if you haven't. Fritz will be around for a couple minutes while we clean up, but everyone drive home safely. And thanks for being here. We'll see you in our next program.
Thank you all.